Normandy, France, June 1944. A low fog drifts over the rolling hills near Saint-Lô. The air smells of damp earth and diesel. From the tree-line, a group of German panzergrenadiers peer through binoculars, their laughter breaking the silence. Down in the valley, American tanks crawl forward, small, boxy silhouettes with rounded turrets and high tracks. Spielzeugpanzer, one of them mutters. Toy tanks. To the Germans, these olive-green machines look clumsy compared to the steel beasts of their own panzer divisions, the tigers and panthers that had ruled Europe's battlefields. But the laughter fades when the Shermans don't stop at the base of the hill. Engines roar higher. One by one, the American tanks climb, treads biting through mud, carrying their weight where heavier German machines would have bogged down. Shells burst in the fog, bright orange flashes cutting the gray. Within minutes, the toy tanks are on the crest, guns leveled. The Germans scramble for cover as their artillery positions are silenced one after another. By the time the smoke clears, the laughter is gone. Only the echo of engines remains, climbing, steady, unstoppable. Because on that hill, German pride met American persistence, and lost. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, tanks were already the kings of the modern battlefield, symbols of national pride, engineering brilliance, and strategic power. Yet not all nations viewed them the same way. For Germany, armored warfare was a doctrine, the beating heart of blitzkrieg. Fast-moving panzer divisions tore through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with terrifying precision. By 1940, German tanks like the Panzer III and IV had become the standard by which all others were measured. They were efficient, lethal, and backed by elite crews trained to think fast and fight aggressively. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had no great armored legend to boast of. America had entered the war late and untested. Its factories were unmatched in capacity but had little experience producing modern fighting vehicles. The U.S. Army still used tanks designed for the interwar years, light, thinly armored, and poorly armed compared to the German machines rolling across Europe. When reports reached Washington and Detroit about the German blitzkrieg, American planners understood one thing clearly: the next war would be fought in steel and oil. The U.S. didn't need a perfect tank, it needed a reliable one. Something that could be built in thousands, repaired in the field, shipped across oceans, and fight on any terrain. Thus began the creation of what would become one of the most recognizable machines in military history, the M4 Sherman. But in 1941 and 1942, before the Sherman's debut, the American concept of warfare was still shaped by mobility, not armor thickness. U.S. generals believed tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs, not duel enemy armor head-on. That belief would soon clash violently with reality. When America joined the war after Pearl Harbor, its armored forces were thrust into combat in North Africa. There, the Germans, under commanders like Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, fielded Panzer IVs and the deadly new Tiger I. These machines carried high-velocity guns capable of piercing Allied tanks from over a mile away. Facing them were American M3 Lees and early Shermans, lighter, faster, but hopelessly outgunned in a straight fight. Yet these battles revealed something the Germans hadn't expected: American tanks could keep moving when theirs broke down. In the blistering desert heat, the Tiger's heavy transmission often failed. Its thick armor demanded constant maintenance, and its fuel consumption was enormous. Meanwhile, the Sherman, with its simpler design and interchangeable parts, could be repaired by crews in the field within hours. When one was destroyed, two more took its place within days. Germany's engineers mocked this philosophy. To them, the Sherman was a crude tool, a toy compared to the meticulously crafted Tigers and Panthers. But what the Germans didn't understand, not yet, was that this simplicity was America's greatest weapon. By 1943, Allied factories were producing Shermans faster than Germany could replace its tanks. Thousands were shipped to Britain, the Soviet Union, and every front where American troops landed. They rolled off assembly lines like clockwork, each one nearly identical, each one part of a grander strategy not of perfection, but of persistence. And in those assembly lines lay the real secret of Allied victory: quantity had its own quality. Still, in the minds of German soldiers who faced them for the first time, these American tanks remained laughable. The Shermans were smaller, thinner, and their 75mm guns seemed weak against the thick armor of the Tigers. Yet battle after battle, the Shermans kept coming. They moved through mud, snow, and sand. They climbed hills and crossed rivers. And when one was lost, its crew was often back in another within days. The German soldiers saw it but didn't yet believe it, that these toy tanks were not toys at all, but the front line of an industrial storm that would eventually roll over Europe itself. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in 1944, the Americans had perfected their use, combining Shermans with infantry, artillery, and air power in a synchronized assault unlike anything the Wehrmacht had faced before. And on those green Norman hills, the final judgment of the Sherman's design would be written, not in factory blueprints or propaganda, but in fire and steel. By the spring of 1944, the Sherman was no longer an experimental machine, it was the beating heart of Allied armor. Over 50,000 units had rolled out of American factories, each one a subtle evolution of the same practical idea: build fast, repair faster, and never stop moving. Yet its design philosophy was a world apart from the German approach. The M4 Sherman wasn't born from the pursuit of mechanical superiority, it was born from logistics. Every bolt, plate, and gear was chosen with production in mind. Where German engineers labored over perfection, American designers embraced functionality. The Sherman's welded hull was easy to mass-produce. Its Continental or Ford engine could be swapped in hours. Its tracks were lighter, giving it better fuel efficiency and mobility on soft ground. Most importantly, its reliability bordered on legendary: it could run for hundreds of miles without major breakdowns. But for all its advantages, it carried a burden, literally. Its 75mm gun, ideal for infantry support, struggled to penetrate the thick armor of German Tigers and Panthers. The Sherman's armor, too, was modest, designed to resist smaller anti-tank guns, not the monstrous 88mm shells the Germans fired. For German tankers, this difference reinforced a sense of superiority. To them, the Sherman was the embodiment of quantity over quality, a rolling symbol of industrial might with little tactical soul. They believed one Tiger could destroy 5 or 10 Shermans before falling. And on paper, that was often true. However, the battlefield was not paper. When the first Shermans landed with American and British forces in North Africa, the crews quickly learned how to turn weaknesses into strengths. The tank's speed and maneuverability allowed flanking attacks that German armor rarely expected. Its turret traversed faster than the heavier Tigers, giving Sherman crews precious seconds to fire first. And perhaps its most overlooked strength was communication. Every Sherman carried reliable radios, a small detail, but one that transformed coordination. German tanks, especially early in the war, often lacked radios, relying on visual signals or flag commands. Shermans could relay information instantly across units, calling for artillery or airstrikes with precision. This integration, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air, was where American doctrine evolved beyond mere machines. The Sherman was not designed to fight alone, it was designed to belong to a system. By 1944, this system had matured into something formidable. The Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Tens of thousands of men, ships, and machines would cross the Channel to break Hitler's fortress Europe. And at the core of that invasion, spearheading every major assault, were the Shermans. In the hedgerows of Normandy, their reputation would be tested as never before. German defenders, dug into the high banks and fields, waited with hidden Panthers and 88mm guns. The terrain was treacherous, narrow lanes, thick vegetation, and hills that turned every approach into a death trap. Early battles were brutal. Shermans burned by the dozens, their crews calling them Ronsons, after the lighter that lights every time. But still, replacements kept coming. Within days, destroyed units were refitted, reorganized, and sent back into the fight. The Germans began to realize something unnerving: no matter how many they destroyed, the Americans always had more. And when the weather turned and the rains came, another surprise unfolded. The German Panthers, with their wide hulls and delicate suspensions, struggled on the muddy slopes. Their engines overheated, their tracks bogged down. The Shermans, lighter and better balanced, climbed, not elegantly, but relentlessly. This wasn't just a difference of engineering. It was a difference of philosophy. The German tanks were masterpieces, expensive, scarce, and irreplaceable. The Shermans were tools, reliable, reparable, and infinite. By the time American armor reached the hills of St. Lo, the German soldiers had already seen enough to lose their certainty. The toy tanks that had once made them laugh were now climbing ground even the mighty tigers feared. And somewhere on one of those Norman hills, a German observer lowered his binoculars in disbelief, because what he was watching wasn't just tanks moving forward. It was the unstoppable weight of an industrial nation, rolling toward Berlin. War, at its core, is not only a contest of machines, it is a contest of men, of nerves, and of adaptation. The story of the Sherman tank's rise from mockery to mastery cannot be told through steel alone. It is the story of the crews inside, young men barely out of high school, who learned to trust a machine others dismissed as weak. The human angle inside a Sherman, space was a luxury no one had. 5 men, driver, co-driver, gunner, loader, and commander, operated in a cramped shell of steel and sweat. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and fear. The armor was thin enough that they could hear bullets ping against it like hail on a tin roof. Many American crews entered battle knowing their tank was statistically inferior. They called the German Tiger a monster, a machine that could destroy them before they even saw it. Yet, despite that knowledge, they went forward. The reason wasn't ignorance. It was training, teamwork, and an almost stubborn faith in movement. Sherman crews developed a simple rule: don't stop. A stationary tank was a dead tank. They relied on speed, coordination, and overwhelming firepower from multiple angles. In battle, they spoke in short bursts over the intercom, calm, clipped, professional. Every man had a role, and hesitation meant death. To these soldiers, survival depended not on what they drove, but how they drove it. They made the Sherman's agility their weapon. When a Tiger fired once, a group of Shermans could flank from both sides, forcing the German crew to split its aim. The Sherman's faster turret traverse, sometimes twice as quick, often gave the Americans the first, desperate shot that made the difference. For many of those men, the toy tank insult no longer mattered. What mattered was that it moved when they needed it to, fired when they pulled the trigger, and brought them home when luck allowed. The technological angle on paper, the Sherman looked unimpressive. Its 75mm gun was underpowered against the Tiger's and Panther's armor. Its hull was thinner, its silhouette taller, and its armor plates not as sharply sloped. But beneath those apparent weaknesses lay design choices that favored reliability over raw strength. The Sherman's suspension system, the vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, allowed smooth movement over rough ground. It was this system that let it climb hills and maneuver through mud that bogged down heavier tanks. Engineers in Detroit and Chicago refined every component for simplicity and mass production. Parts were interchangeable, an almost unheard of concept in armored warfare at the time. Every Sherman could share parts with another, no matter which factory built it. This allowed frontline mechanics to cannibalize wrecked tanks and bring others back into battle within hours. While German panzers required specialized workshops and tools, American maintenance teams carried wrenches, not miracles. Then there was the engine. Some Shermans ran on radial aircraft engines, others on Ford the 5th 8S or Chrysler multibank engines, all designed for easy access and quick repair. This meant that in the field, American tank battalions rarely sat idle. Another unsung advantage was visibility. The Sherman had excellent optics and periscopes, giving its crew better situational awareness. German tanks, despite their superior guns, often suffered from restricted vision, particularly the Tiger, whose commander relied heavily on limited periscopes. This balance of practicality and simplicity made the Sherman the most versatile tank of the war. It could be modified into dozens of variants: flamethrower tanks, bridge layers, mine clearers, and amphibious versions. Its adaptability reflected the American mindset: if it works, improve it; if it fails, replace it. The Germans called this approach crude. But to the Allies, it was efficient, and efficiency wins wars. The emotional shift as the war progressed, even the perception among soldiers began to shift. German veterans who had once mocked the Sherman began to respect, even fear, its persistence. They saw how quickly the Americans replaced their losses, how the wrecks of one battle returned as fresh armor days later. In contrast, German tank crews knew that every lost Tiger was irreplaceable. Every destroyed Panther was a blow to the Reich's dwindling industry. By late 1944, German factories were bombed, supply lines were shattered, and fuel was scarce. The Sherman, by comparison, seemed infinite. That realization weighed heavily on German morale. For every tank they destroyed, 3 more came over the next hill. For every victory, a new column appeared the next morning. It wasn't just the tanks that were advancing, it was an entire industrial system in motion, an army of factories across an ocean, fighting without ever seeing the battlefield. And so the laughter, the mockery of toy tanks, began to fade, replaced by unease. The Germans started calling them something else: der endlose Strom, the endless stream. The tactical angle in the European theater, the Sherman tank was never meant to fight alone. American doctrine had evolved around the idea of combined arms warfare, a seamless coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power. The tank's job wasn't to duel enemy armor, it was to support infantry, break through defensive lines, and exploit mobility. When Shermans rolled forward, they rarely did so without a web of support. Infantry units followed closely behind, clearing anti-tank positions. Artillery batteries were on standby to blanket suspected ambush sites. Above them, fighter bombers, the feared P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons, prowled the skies, ready to strike any German armor caught in the open. This coordination was something the Germans admired, even envied. By 1944, their own air support had withered under Allied bombing, and their supply networks were fragmented. The Wehrmacht's once fluid blitzkrieg had slowed into a desperate defensive war. In contrast, the Americans advanced like a machine, not fast, but steady. Each element fed the other. If the Shermans met resistance, they radioed for air strikes. If German counterattacks threatened their flanks, artillery roared within minutes. It was a war of integration, of systems, and in that environment, the Sherman thrived. It wasn't invincible, but it didn't need to be. All it needed to do was keep moving forward. The German perspective for the German tankers of the late war, the battlefield had become a paradox. On one hand, they commanded the finest machines ever built, the Tiger I, Tiger II, and Panther, each a masterpiece of firepower and armor. On the other, they were trapped by the very perfection they once glorified. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman at over 2 kilometers, yet its weight made it sluggish. In narrow Norman roads, it was difficult to maneuver. Its transmission was fragile, its fuel consumption disastrous. A Tiger crew could spend more time maintaining their tank than fighting in it. And worst of all, they were few. Very few. By 1944, only about 1,300 Tiger IIs were ever produced, compared to over 49,000 Shermans. Every destroyed Tiger meant months of industrial effort lost forever. German tank crews began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. Each engagement was a gamble, even a victorious Tiger might be stranded without fuel or bogged in the mud after a few miles. To the frontline soldiers, the Sherman's constant reappearance became surreal. We're Skiasen Sie nieder, und Sie kommen wieder, we shoot them down, and they come again. It wasn't just frustrating, it was demoralizing. The Germans realized that American warfare wasn't about perfection, it was about momentum. Every tank, plane, and truck was part of a rhythm too vast to interrupt. Even their commanders, like Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, admitted privately that the Allies' production power had rewritten the rules of war. Germany could no longer compete on terms of quantity, only delay the inevitable through skill and defensive genius. But on the ground, against an advancing wall of Sherman supported by artillery and air dominance, even genius had limits. The moral and psychological angle. By the time of the Normandy campaign, the psychology of tank warfare had shifted. For German soldiers, facing Shermans was no longer a matter of tactical competition, it was survival against an endless tide. Every destroyed American tank was replaced. Every fallen crew was avenged by another formation advancing behind them. German propaganda still boasted of superior weapons, the Wunderwaffe, the miracle arms, but those words rang hollow in the mud of Normandy. The Americans fought differently. They treated the battlefield as a network, not a duel. For every tank that failed, there were logistics officers rerouting replacements, engineers reinforcing bridges, and mechanics working under floodlights to repair damaged hulls. This machine-like efficiency took a toll on German morale. Tank aces who once viewed their missions as sport, counting kills, marking victories on gun barrels, began to realize that numbers no longer mattered. Against an industrial giant, heroism could not win a war. Many German diaries from 1944 to 45 reflect this shift. They speak less of pride, more of exhaustion. They never stop, one Panzergrenadier wrote after St. Lo. Even when the earth swallows them, the next morning they rise again. Machines without end. The American tankers, too, carried scars, physical and emotional. They lost friends daily, sometimes entire crews in seconds. But unlike their enemy, they could afford to hope. Behind them was a nation that never stopped building, shipping, and believing that endurance would outlast brilliance. By the summer of 1944, this contest of philosophies, precision versus persistence, was nearing its climax. The Germans still held the high ground in many places across Normandy, especially along the steep, hedgerow-covered ridges that commanded every approach. And it was on one such ridge, a hill that the Germans believed no Sherman could climb, where the laughter would finally die. It was July 1944, near the town of St. Lo in Normandy, a region of green hedgerows and low, stubborn hills that had become the crucible of the Allied campaign. For weeks, American forces had tried to break through the German lines, but every advance met fierce resistance from panzer divisions entrenched on the high ground. Among those positions was a modest rise known simply as Hill 192. It wasn't tall, but it commanded the surrounding countryside, every road, every movement visible from its crest. For the Germans, it was the perfect vantage point. For the Americans, it was an immovable wall. The 2nd Infantry Division and the 741st Tank Battalion had been ordered to take that hill. Reports from scouts were grim. The slopes were mined, the hedgerows thick with machine guns, and somewhere beyond them, hidden in the tree line, waited a detachment of Panzer IVs and Panthers. As dawn broke on July 11, fog rolled through the fields. The Shermans sat at the edge of a shattered orchard, engines idling low, their exhausts whispering through the mist. Inside one of them, a 21-year-old commander from Ohio checked his watch. He'd seen what German guns could do. Every man in that tank knew the odds, and still, they went forward. Artillery thundered first. Hundreds of shells crashed onto the German positions, churning the earth, cutting gaps through the hedgerows. Then came the order, advance. The Shermans lurched forward, their treads grinding through mud and debris. They fired as they moved, high-explosive shells smashing into tree lines and bunkers. But the Germans had waited for this moment. Hidden 88mm guns opened fire, each shot a flash of orange light followed by the heavy thud of impact. One Sherman exploded instantly, its turret thrown aside like a coin. Another caught fire, smoke curling from its hatches as the crew scrambled out. The rest pressed on. The slope of Hill 192 was worse than expected, slick, uneven, and laced with craters. German tanks, positioned higher up, fired down with impunity. Yet the Shermans did not stop. Their engines roared, treads biting deep, climbing where heavier tigers would have sunk. Observers on the German line watched in disbelief. "They're coming up the hill," one officer shouted. It seemed madness, those light, American tanks forcing their way uphill under direct fire. But it was happening. Every time a Sherman was hit, another veered around the wreck, using it as cover to return fire. Infantry followed close behind, tossing grenades and clearing trenches. The entire hillside became a rolling storm of noise, engines, gunfire, explosions, and shouted orders drowned beneath the chaos. From above, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts screamed over the ridge, strafing German positions. The coordination was surgical, artillery fell on the crest, the tanks climbed below, and aircraft pinned the defenders down. For the Germans, it was an assault unlike anything they'd faced. Their lines were breaking not because of superior firepower, but because of relentless motion. The Shermans kept advancing, unstoppable, mechanical in their determination. A German Panther tried to reposition, turning to bring its gun to bear on the climbing tanks. But in the churned soil, its tracks slipped, heavy, unyielding steel mired in the slope. A Sherman seized the moment, circling through a hedgerow, its gun elevated to an impossible angle. The 75mm round struck the Panther's side armor, followed by a second hit that set it ablaze. By noon, the hill was littered with wrecks, both American and German, burning together in thick, black smoke. But for the first time in weeks, U.S. forces held the crest. Hill 192 had fallen. When the surviving Germans withdrew, they left behind destroyed positions and a sobering realization. The tanks they'd once called Spielzeugpanzer, toy tanks, had climbed terrain their own could not. An officer's field report recovered later that day read simply, "They are not weak. They are many. And they never stop." It was a small victory in the grand scale of the war, one hill among thousands. But it marked something far greater, the psychological shift. The American tank, once ridiculed, had proven its worth not through dominance, but through endurance. That day, on the muddy slopes of St. Lo, the myth of German invincibility began to crumble. The Shermans had shown what they were built for, not brilliance, but persistence. Yet their greatest test of that endurance was still to come, in winter, amid snow and fire, when the German army launched its final, desperate counterattack in the Ardennes. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes forest. The trees were heavy with snow, the air so still that even the rumble of engines seemed to vanish into the white. The American soldiers stationed there believed the front was quiet, a resting line before spring. They were wrong. At 5:30 a.m., the horizon erupted. Thousands of German artillery guns opened fire at once, their shells tearing through the silence and shaking the frozen ground. Within minutes, entire towns vanished in smoke. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Hitler's last great gamble to split the Allied armies and force a new peace. For the Americans on the ground, confusion reigned. Communication lines were down, roads were choked with snow, and German armored divisions, including the fearsome Panther and Tiger II tanks, were pushing hard through the forests. And somewhere along those winding roads, the humble Shermans waited again. At first glance, it looked hopeless. The German tanks were monsters, heavier, thicker, with guns that could destroy a Sherman before the Americans even saw them. But war is rarely fought on paper. The real battlefield is chaos, mud, and fear, and in that chaos, the Shermans had one weapon that the Germans didn't: speed. In the town of Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, the 10th Armored Division dug in. Snow fell steadily, covering everything in a pale shroud. Inside their tanks, crews huddled close to the engines for warmth, breathing through scarves stiff with frost. Supplies were low. Ammunition was scarce. But no one was giving up that town. From the north, German panzers began to advance through the narrow streets. Their 88mm guns fired with terrifying precision, each shell echoing through the stone alleys. One by one, Shermans were knocked out, their crews leaping into the snow, dragging wounded comrades behind cover. Yet even as tanks burned, others maneuvered through the maze of rubble. The Shermans were smaller, a disadvantage in open combat, but a gift in close quarters. They could turn tighter, hide faster, and strike from unexpected angles. One American tank commander, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, later described it: "We didn't fight them head-on. We fought like ghosts, appear, fire, disappear." His crew's Sherman, the Cobra King, led the charge when the siege broke. Under relentless artillery fire, they powered through Bastogne frozen streets, clearing German roadblocks and freeing trapped infantry units. By Christmas, the defenders were still holding on. And then came the radio message that would echo through the war, to the German commander: "Nuts." A single word, defiant and absurd, but it summed up everything about that battle. Meanwhile, farther north, near the town of Stavelot, another tank battalion faced a nightmare. The German 1st SS Panzer Division, commanded by Joachim Paper, was advancing with dozens of heavy tanks, cutting through villages with brutal efficiency. The Americans had little to stop them, just a handful of Shermans and a few towed anti-tank guns. But the terrain, once again, favored the underdog. The roads were narrow, icy, and lined with dense woods. The heavy Tigers could barely maneuver. So the Shermans waited in ambush. Hidden under snow-covered tarps, engines off, they listened. When the first German column appeared, the lead tank hit a mine and halted. That was the moment. 3 Shermans fired at once, their muzzle flashes lighting up the fog. The first shell struck a Panther's track, immobilizing it. The second hit the roadblock of wreckage, sealing the column. The third, a lucky shot, penetrated a Tiger's side armor near the rear. Flames burst from its engine deck, black smoke curling into the trees. The Germans returned fire furiously, but the Americans had already moved, backing into the woods, reappearing at another angle. Hit and run, strike and vanish. By nightfall, the road was littered with twisted metal, and the panzer column had stalled. It wasn't a decisive victory, not yet, but it was enough. Every hour they delayed the German advance, reinforcements closed in from the west. The tide was turning. By January, the snow was melting, and so was the last hope of the German army. Their mighty tanks, the ones that had once terrorized Europe, now lay abandoned, out of fuel, their crews retreating on foot. When the Allied lines finally closed around the Bulge, the battlefield was a graveyard of steel. Panthers and Tigers lay silent beside the smaller Shermans that had beaten them through sheer endurance. A German prisoner, interviewed later, said something remarkable: "Your tanks should not have survived. But they always came back. Every time we thought we destroyed them all, more appeared." That was the story of the Sherman. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the prettiest, but always there. Always moving. By the end of the war, over 49,000 Shermans had been built. They rolled through France, Belgium, and Germany itself. They crossed the Rhine, pushed into Berlin, and then, when the guns fell silent, many were simply left behind, the ghosts of a relentless machine that refused to die. The Germans had once called them toys. But history would remember them as the tanks that never stopped fighting, and never stopped winning. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ashes. Cities lay in ruin, fields were torn by craters, and millions of soldiers, from both sides, had vanished into the smoke of a war that consumed the world. Amid the wreckage, along the roads that led from Normandy to Berlin, thousands of tanks sat abandoned. Rusting, burned, their barrels bent skyward like the bones of a mechanical graveyard. Among them, the Sherman stood quietly, scarred, dented, but still recognizable. Its green hull carried stories in every dent and scratch: the mud of Normandy, the snow of the Ardennes, the dust of the Ruhr. For many who survived, it was more than a tank. It was home. The German crews who once mocked it as a Spielzeugpanzer, a toy, came to respect it. Not because it outgunned or outarmored their panzers, but because it never stopped coming. When one Sherman fell, another took its place. And behind every one of them was a crew of young men, often barely 20 years old, who fought not for glory, but simply to survive the next hill, the next field, the next dawn. In the cold arithmetic of war, the Sherman was never perfect. Its armor was too thin. Its gun, for much of the conflict, too small. Many tankers called it a death trap. And yet, in the broader logic of strategy, it became one of the most successful fighting machines in history, not through invincibility, but through availability. Where Germany built masterpieces of engineering, America built instruments of endurance. The Sherman could be repaired in the field, its parts swapped in hours, its engine replaced with a wrench and teamwork. It could travel hundreds of miles without breaking down. It could be shipped by the thousands across the Atlantic, unloaded, fueled, and sent straight into combat. Every flaw it had, every shortcoming, was balanced by one thing the Germans never fully mastered: logistics. The Allies didn't need the best tank. They needed the tank that was there. When historians later compared the Sherman to the German Tigers and Panthers, the numbers told a quiet truth. On paper, the German tanks were superior, in power, armor, and range. But in the end, those machines often sat idle, waiting for fuel that never came, or broken tracks that no factory could replace. Meanwhile, the Shermans kept rolling. And rolling. And rolling. They were in every theater: North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, the Pacific Islands. By the end of the war, they had fought on 3 continents, under more flags than any other armored vehicle in history. It wasn't just a tank anymore. It was a symbol of the Allied spirit, flawed, human, persistent, unstoppable. After the war, many Shermans were melted down, recycled into the steel of a rebuilding world. Others found new lives, in Israel, Korea, and even on parade grounds of newly independent nations. Decades later, their engines would still start. Their tracks would still turn. And somewhere in the hills of Normandy, where it all began, a few still stand today, monuments to a generation that fought with what they had, and made it enough. Visitors walk past them quietly. Children run their hands along the metal, tracing the scars left by enemy shells. Some stop and read the names painted faintly on the side: Lucky Lady, Fury, Thunderbolt, Cobra King. Names given not to machines, but to companions. Each name carries a story, of fear, courage, and the terrible beauty of endurance. In the grand halls of history, the Sherman may never hold the same mystique as the Tiger or the Panther. It wasn't born of perfection. It was born of necessity. But perhaps that's why it won. Because war, in the end, is not a contest of engineering, it's a contest of will. And when will meets machinery, the machine that lasts longer, that keeps moving forward, one hill at a time, is the one that changes history. The Germans had the mightiest tanks. The Americans had the most determined men. Together, in the mud and smoke of Europe, they proved a truth as old as war itself: you don't win because you're stronger. You win because you refuse to stop climbing. Fade out. The sound of distant engines fades into silence. A final shot lingers, a lone Sherman on a quiet French hill, facing the sunrise. The same hill that once made the Germans laugh. Narrator: calmly, they called it a toy. But on the hills of Europe, it became the engine of freedom.